Hello, my name is Christie Carson and I'm a reader in Shakespeare and Performance in the English department at Royal Holloway, University of London. I want to give you a few points about things to talk about when discussing Hamlet. It's an enormously complicated play and obviously you can continue to study it throughout your life, but I think there are 5 ways in which you can get quite interested in a range of aspects of it quite quickly. So here are my 5 points. The first one is the idea of isolation and alienation, thinking particularly of Hamlet himself, but some of the other characters as well. The next point is the other family relationships within the play. There are 2 families and each of them has potential for really quite disturbing internal relationships. The third point I want to think about is the context. Again, where is this Denmark? Is it as Shakespeare would have thought of it, possibly actually the court of England, or is it somewhere else altogether? A lot of contemporary performances have placed the play in all sorts of different contexts, and that's something I want to think about. The fourth point is looking at the ending of the play, and again, who knows what, who understands what, in terms of there's an awful lot of action in that last scene of the play, and if you're not paying attention, it's quite difficult to know which of the characters are in on that procession towards death and the great pile of death that occurs at the end of the play. And then finally, the last thing I want to think about is the textual complexities of the play. It's something you might not want to look at straight away with this play, but it is something that increasingly I think you need to deal with at some point when thinking about Hamlet. There isn't just one possible Hamlet, there are several possible Hamlets that you can study. So if we go back to those points one at a time, the first one is the idea of isolation and alienation. Now, Hamlet as a character was very unique when he was first written. That idea of the character thinking through his own emotions and his own actions and his own motivations with the audience in conversation. Now, this isn't the play that we're seeing here, but I think what you get from the image on the cover of the book that I've done with the Globe Theatre is that idea of the soliloquies not being an individual standing by themselves, in a spotlight. It's about a conversation and about looking to the audience. The soliloquies are filled with questions, and quite often they're questions that the audience may not speak an answer to, but verbally they might gesture towards an answer. They might nod, they might smile, they might laugh. And those are all things that the actor interacts with. And I think that actors have learned an enormous amount in terms of that idea of creating a character on the stage who opens his heart and opens his mind to the audience. But actually, in terms of the other characters, he is very closed. He doesn't speak to them, he doesn't engage with them. And so what Shakespeare sets up is this really interesting and quite complicated interaction between the audience, the character, and the other characters on stage. Now, this is something I think that young people can really understand in a much more direct way than they used to be able to in some ways, because a lot of them have that kind of presence, that kind of exposition of their deepest thoughts online. They don't express them to their parents or to their siblings or even to people at school, but they might have a blog or a video or their Instagram where they show hints, bits of their life, which are quite personal in this very open way, but then as individuals they stay quite closed. So I think that in a strange way, Hamlet's gone from being quite an unusual character to being somebody that each of us can identify with, and quite a few, particularly of the younger generation, have that vision of isolation in their everyday life and can relate directly to the character of Hamlet and the struggles that he faces. So the next point is this idea of uncomfortable relationships within the family. Now, the obvious one is between Gertrude and Hamlet, and there certainly have been Freudian approaches to that and suggestions that that's potentially even a little bit incestuous as a relationship. But there are other relationships that are complicated and push the boundaries of what's normal within a family. The other obvious one is, of course, that Gertrude has married Hamlet's uncle once his father has died, and that causes him all sorts of distress. But there was, at least in some traditions, an expectation that that would be the case, that a widow would not be left on her own, but would in fact be expected to be brought back into the family. The other family that's involved is the family of Polonius, Laertes, and Ophelia. And again, they're a family unit which has no mother, and so they can be seen as very, very close, but they also have a strange relationship in terms of the main family within the court because they are subordinate. And this is something that both Laertes and Polonius are very aware of, particularly in their warnings about how close Ophelia gets to Hamlet, and the question of whether it is legitimate for them to marry. Again, sometimes I've seen in contemporary performance Laertes and Ophelia being cast as black actors, which again gives a sense of distance for them, or a bit of a sense of being outsiders within the court community. And one of the things that can happen because of this sense of them being, together but outside, is that either the relationship between Ophelia and Polonius or the relationship between Laertes and Ophelia are seen as a little too close. And again, those are things that I think have come out in contemporary performance. But what it does is it challenges the whole environment that they're in, where you have unusual families that don't have two parents. Again, something I think that students today can really relate to, because there is this idea of how does the relationship shift? Thinking about grief, and when one parent is lost, how does that affect the remaining members of the family? So this comes to the next point, which is this idea of context and where it's set. Again, many productions try to put it into a regal setting where it really is a king and a prince. Others try to move it away to a much more sort of pedestrian environment where the king is the head of a corporation or a drug cartel or something like that, rather than an actual king. So the hierarchical relationships and kingship are something that we're less familiar with. So again, I think contemporary performance really tries sometimes to make that shift towards something that we will understand a bit better, the Corporation of Denmark, as in the Ethan Hawke film. So I think that it's really worthwhile seeing a number of different interpretations of it, whether that be on film or on stage or television adaptation, just to see how the characters change depending upon what that context is. Is there more at stake? Is there less at stake? And also that relationship between the two families, as I say, can change if the social difference between the two groups is not so distinct. So just thinking about how we can relate to the ideas of a young prince in Denmark 400 years ago, I think there are certainly ways in which we can do that, but how we interact with that depends a great deal on that context. Then my fourth point is this idea of the ending. And there are two things that in contemporary performance people think about a lot. One is whether or not Gertrude knows that she is conscientiously drinking poison. Does she know that her now husband killed her former husband? Did she have a relationship with him before? These are all questions which a person playing Gertrude certainly has to decide. And when she drinks the poison, is she trying to save her son from a similar fate to the one that her husband encountered? So that, I think, is a really key question. The other key question, and again, it's one that changes a great deal from performance to performance, is whether or not the play ends before Fortinbras arrives. Now, this idea of Fortinbras as this great military leader is sounded throughout the play, and then he arrives at the end. Now, one of the questions is, what kind of a land will it be once this military leader takes over? But in other productions, Fortinbras is eliminated altogether. And what does that mean? So we have this enormous drama, and again, as I say, enormous number of bodies at the end. But then you have this huge shift towards an entirely different world when Fortinbras arrives. And how do the other people in the court react to that? Do they immediately switch allegiances over to Fortinbras, or do they stick with Hamlet and try to tell the tale of what has happened before he has arrived? So the very last point is the idea of textual complexity. Many of the plays we only have in one version. Hamlet is not like that. We actually have a good quarto and a bad quarto, as well as the folio. Now, you might want to read up a bit more about that, but one of the fundamental things that does is mean that when a production company or a director approaches the play, they have to decide a number of things in terms of which of the different versions of the play they're going to follow. But the key one is, where is to be or not to be? And that can change quite dramatically the progression of the character of Hamlet. So I'm not going to talk an enormous amount about that, but I have given you a couple of links to both an article by Anne Thompson that discusses the different positions of to be or not to be, and also some performances of it, because again, I think how you perform that particular speech can be a kind of marker for the whole play in a lot of respects. Unlike, I suppose, in some ways, the other soliloquies which move the action forward, it is a sort of stepping out, and it's a philosophical debate about what is the point of living. And so in some ways, it doesn't matter where it is. It's kind of an explanation of what the play is about, which stands outside of the play in some respects. Not everyone will agree with that, but I think that To Be or Not to Be stands on its own in a really quite dramatic way, in the way that some of the other soliloquies don't. So that's my little summary of Hamlet. I'll just go over quickly those 5 points again. There's isolation and alienation. The second one is the family relationships in terms of the two different families. The third is the context, where the play is set. The fourth is the ending of the play and what the next stage will be after this ending. And the fifth one is this idea of textual complexity in the play. And it's something that I think is worth touching on, even if you don't go into a great deal about it. So I hope that those tips are helpful, and very best of luck in teaching Hamlet by William Shakespeare.